Today we just want to give a brief overview of the economic outlook that's currently facing China. There's clearly the Chinese economic story is consistently in the news these days. Not only with the economic miracle, so-called, of the export and the Lord's factory and so forth, but also recently with the dip in the GDP, which we'll talk about in a moment, and just recently, of course, there's been some renewed plans for sort of stimulus investment into the economy to bring the GDP figures up. On the first slide, I've just got basically a present economic snapshot of where China is today. And of course, I mean, we look at the first thing there, we all know that China's GDP growth has been exponential and spectacular. It's tapered off a little recently, however, it's still way above anyone else in the developed world. China, of course, has recently passed both Japan and Germany as the second largest economy in the world, trailing only the USA, of course. The question when China will take over the US is on everyone's mind. It's more symbolic than anything, I think. I wouldn't read too much into it. Some people predict this might happen about 2020. Others who are more bullish on China believe it might be earlier, about 2017. Again, a lot of it is largely symbolic, but it is something that I think will be cheered heavily from the Chinese sidelines, to the very least. GDP growth, I suppose, is probably the most important aspect. I mean, China's economic miracle has been based upon GDP growth rates in excess of 12% consistently for a period of 10 or more years. Where the government wants the GDP rate to be is about 8%, 8.5%. Anything below that is considered sluggish, which is extraordinary when you consider the growth rates in the States and in Europe at this current time. Last year, even what would be considered a bad year, the growth in China was 9.2%. In the first quarter 2012, it's been 8.1%, but actually it's dipping quite markedly after that, and we have predictions for 2012 of maybe something down to 7.5%, which is considered bad for Chinese purposes. But basically, the government wanted to be about 8%. They would love it there, 8 to 8.5. 7.5 would be considered to be sluggish. If it goes under 6%, then there are problems. There would be considered to be a lot of problems. Should be noted, though, that it's not an even GDP rate across the country. China, of course, is an enormous country, and we'll talk a little bit more about the different regions of China and how it's very unsafe to consider China as one country. It's a series of countries in many ways, both culturally, both politically, both economically also. For example, in the more developed East Coast region, which, and again, we'll look at some maps in a moment, the East Coast is a very developed region with Shanghai, Hong Kong, Guangdong, and places like this. We have GDP rates around 8%. However, if you go into the interior, where a lot of regional cities, what we call second and third tier cities, and I'll talk a little bit more about those in a moment, we see growth rates at about 18%. So it's uneven growth, and a lot of the new opportunities being sought after in China by foreign companies actually are taking place in regional cities because of this spectacular growth going on. The big issue, I think, particularly from a US perspective, is the next figure. The GDP per capita is very low in China, only about $4,800 US. Compare this to the US GDP per capita figure, which is about 48,000. So a huge difference. I mean, GDP is about 10 times less per capita than it is in the States. China's still a very poor country. It's still underdeveloped. It's not a developed nation. It's getting richer, particularly on the East Coast, particularly in the big cities. The middle class is rising, and this is creating huge opportunities. But it's very uneven. There is still a lot of, still a good 60% to 70% of the population is still agrarian and land-based, and are on very low wages. The disparity between the rich and poor is growing markedly in China, and potentially could cause some problems in the future. It's something the government's very aware of, and is trying its best to alleviate. Ease of doing business, again, a snapshot. China, it's a very difficult place to do business. It ranks, you'll see on the chart there, number 79. In fact, the new charts show it sitting at about 89.90. So it's actually slipped down, ease of doing business ranks markedly, and it doesn't appear to be getting any better. And it's quite difficult for foreign companies to operate here. If you ask any of your clients that have operations here, I think they'll echo this. They'll also probably echo that there are still big profits to be made here, and that's why they're expanding here. Just to note, though, Hong Kong, which is considered to be the gateway to China, it always ranks #1 for ease of doing business. Hong Kong is a foreign country as far as China is concerned, although of course it is both economically, politically, and physically a part of China. So interesting comparison there. Exports, again, exports has always been the big picture for China. The export figure is falling because China is recalibrating its economic model from an export model to a domestic consumption model. So what we'll see generally in the future is the exports will generally come down, but imports will go up, and this offers great opportunities again for American and European exporters. And also people that want to sell into China. Everything these days is calibrated towards selling to the Chinese public. So what we're seeing at the moment is a huge influx of Western companies who are either starting operations here for the first time or expanding their operations if they already have them here. And it's basically in order to sell products to the Chinese. So this is a huge new area which is growing very markedly. So exports are going down, imports are going up. Inflation is the big problem area for the Chinese government. What we're seeing in the past, particularly last year, was very high inflation rates, and in fact, inflation out of control in some places. The inflation at this time last year was sitting at about 6.5%. But when we look at some of the things like the food component, there was inflation of 16 to 20% going on. And you consider when the investment rate in China is 1.2% offered by the banks. You can see that the Chinese people were losing ground fast. The government's highly aware of this. One of their biggest issues is to keep a lid on inflation, and they've done that successfully. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. The last thing is, as you know, China is still a communist country. It seems hard to believe, but it is. And they do use these 5-year plans, the famous 5-year plan. We've just had a new one. And basically the headline issues from that are steady as she goes, keep the growth rate, GDP rate, at about 8%, keep inflation under 4%, and recalibrate the economy from a low-value export model to a domestic consumption model. And this is what the government is doing. Again, here the next slide just shows some charts just showing how the growth has been over the last 10 years or so, and what we predict in the next few years. And you can see that GDP, the real GDP rate, tapering off somewhat to a flat line. In fact, currently that's going to go down a little bit. Remember, if it goes under 6%, or 6%, people consider that that's a very serious thing indeed. Not for just China, but also the world. Again, there's an interesting little slide we've got now, just comparing, and there's a map of China comparing different European sort of economies to the Chinese economy. China, as you can see, is huge, and it's very diverse and can't really be considered to be a one country, although culturally it is. There are vast differences between north, between south, between east, between the central regions and the western regions, both in development, both in economic, financial sense, and also in development infrastructure sides. But what's remarkable, and sometimes we often call it the 9 nations of China, and sometimes the nations are divided. There's 4 major big cities: Beijing in the north, Shanghai, of course, in the center, Guangdong down south, and also Hong Kong, Shenzhen down south. They're the big main cities, and then sort of 4 other regions. There's the northeast, which is the old industrial belt. There's the west, which is basically undeveloped totally. There's the central region, which is basically just the new growth region, and then there's the eastern side, which is the developed region, which most people know of. 9 different nations, 9 different really approaches are required by the government to both the macro and microeconomic approaches. It's good to see sometimes China as almost a United States of China, or also a European Union of China in that sense. And these little charts, and I've got one next showing you some US states. Each of the little areas here represents a Chinese province. And here's this little graphic shows you how big some of these things are. And right in the centre of that, to the right, you'll see Finland there, and that represents Shanghai. So what that's basically saying is that a city, being Shanghai, has a GDP, has an economy as big as a country, being Finland. Quite extraordinary. If you go down to the bottom there, where you see Indonesia, that's referring to the province of Guangdong, which is probably, this is where the people know the Canton Fair, which is Guangzhou, one of probably the first and most developed and wealthiest provinces of China. That has an equivalent GDP to Indonesia, which, as you know, is the most populous Muslim nation in the world. Even Hong Kong, we all know Hong Kong, we've all been there, we've all seen it, quite an extraordinary city. It has an economy that's as big as Egypt, which is quite startling, really, when you think about it. And again, you can look through even some provinces in the middle of China, Vietnam and Malaysia. You see there, they're two fairly undeveloped provinces, but they're as big as the countries of Malaysia and Vietnam. I might add that as you look across these provinces, every capital of these provinces is considered to be a second or third tier city. So all these, and probably they have got populations of over 5 million. China itself has over 180 cities with more than 1 million people. They say that in 10 years there will be 250 cities of over 1 million people. And I might just for comparison purposes, there's only 35 cities in Europe with over 1 million people. China is huge and growing extraordinarily in vast leaps. Just the next slide is just not a great slide, I know, but we just thought we'd put that up to compare. And these are the various US states as they compare in GDP size to some of the Chinese provinces. Just for something, you see right in the middle, it refers to Wisconsin to the right there. That actually refers to Shanghai. So in this scenario, Shanghai City, the city of Shanghai has an economy as big as Wisconsin, which is quite extraordinary. Again, you go down the bottom there and you look at Hong Kong. Hong Kong's economy is as big as Connecticut, which again is, and Guangdong province is as big as Pennsylvania. Quite extraordinary stuff. If you just look where Wisconsin is, you'll see New Jersey above and Georgia below. That area is what we call the Yangtze River Delta, and that's really the powerhouse industrial area of China. And the New Jersey refers to Jiangsu province, which is above Shanghai, which has got probably the most concentration of foreign-owned companies in China. And just underneath is Georgia, which refers to Zhejiang province. These three provinces, together with Shanghai, really make up. There's about maybe a 50 to $100 million population here, and probably the biggest market in China, the biggest growing market also. So a very interesting area. We're just going to give you some figures on, as I mentioned before, the inflation is the biggest problem in China, or has been the biggest problem. The government seems to have it under control, but I just want to give you a snapshot of what the average family in Shanghai has to pay. And these figures, these increases are year on year. So this was 2010 to 2011. We're seeing, just ordinary prices going up between 5 to 10% every year. And this is causing enormous problems for China. Although people's income is rising remarkably, we also see costs going up heavily. On the next slide, there's just some issues about inflation. The government has it under control, but only because they put a big squeeze on the credit, on supply of money supply. Now they've actually reversed that decision, and they're actually releasing more money in order to stimulate growth. We probably will see that inflation figure go up. So I think inflation, though, is something to be watched, and it could be a big problem in the future. The housing bubble. You probably read a lot about the housing bubble. Here's an interesting graphic that shows you 3 housing bubbles: Japan back in the 70s, US, of course, a few years ago, and China. You can see that China and the US are poised right at a similar position at the moment. So a lot of people are asking, is the Chinese housing bubble about to burst? Well, the answer is probably no. There's a major difference between the US and China. and that is much of the residential housing market is underpinned by equity and not debt. Whereas in the States you could have got bought a home with 95% debt. In China that could never happen. And basically what happens here is you might have a mixture of 50-50. So it'd be 50% debt and 50% equity. So there's a lot better underpinning of real equity in this market. There's another reason why there probably won't be a bursting of the bubble is because the government simply cannot afford to allow it to happen. Most of the lending, a good 90% of the lending is done by Chinese state-owned banks, and there's about 4 or 5 or 6 major banks which do all the lending here. And of course, if there was a bursting of the bubble, it would cause the state-owned banks to collapse, and that would be totally unacceptable to the government. So I think the better view is at the moment that there won't be a bubble, despite a lot of the gloom and doom coming from the West on this. And here's another graphic just giving some issues for and against, which we can have a look at. Inflation is a big issue in China, particularly in human resources and wages inflation. It seems extraordinary that in a country of 1.3 billion people that there would be problems with wages and shortages of labour, but that's exactly what's happening at the moment. We're seeing an absolute explosion in HR costs and seeing huge shortages in our HR capacity. We've seen basic unskilled workers' wages double over the last 2 years. We'll see them double again in the next 2 years. And of course, once you get to the skilled level or the experience level, the prices are getting a lot bigger. This is a problem the government hasn't got under control, and it's a problem that's causing a lot of angst for not only foreign businesses operating in China, but also Chinese businesses also. China no longer is a cheap labour model. The HR issue is something that really has to be considered in the future. I think just the last slide I want to talk about is this concept called chimerica. The symbolic relationship between China and America. This term was coined by a professor at Harvard, and it's sort of it's catching on quite a bit. I think it really is just all about people talk about a trade war. People talk about the currency war between the US, and people talk about the Chinese investing their foreign exchange profits in propping up the US economy. It's a lot more complicated than that. I think China, now the number 1 and number 2 economies in the world, are so economically entwined by both the imports, the exports, the investment into US treasuries, and so on and so forth, that it is almost impossible to unwind. There's no, it's simply the case, and you can see this between the GDPs are now coming to very close together, although there's still a big disparity between GDP per capita. I think that despite a lot of the press and despite a lot of the doomsayers, the Chinese government and the US governments, whether they be Republican or Democrat, realise that this extraordinary relationship is necessary for both countries, and will do everything to protect it, despite the saber rattling. And I think we can see this economic dependence and interdependence to get much more sophisticated as time goes by. I think you'll be hearing a lot more about chimerica, and with the demise, I suppose, for the moment of Europe, the concept of chimerica becomes much more important.